I only needed shelter. But that broken brass son already knew my family.
No coat worth pawning, no room key, no family willing to answer, just a canvas tool roll and $10 she had hidden inside its torn hem. And with that $10, she bought a condemned historic orrery maker's studio beyond Germantown Avenue in Philadelphia County, Pennsylvania, erased from tax maps in 1976. The north wall had bowed 6 inches outward. Half the roof lay open beneath winter rain. The county condemned it on October 14, 2022, and scheduled demolition for the following spring. But inside its broken brass son waited a double-walled chamber, unopened for more than 70 years, holding money, equations, and a truth about her own blood. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Wren Elise Calder had been measuring her whole life without knowing it. As a child, she counted the stairs to every apartment her family rented, the seconds between thunder and rain, and the months when the electric bill stayed paid. She could tell when a table leaned by resting 2 fingers on its edge. At school, she'd filled notebook margins with circles turning around a penciled center. Her father, Daniel Calder, repaired elevators in Center City and came home smelling of machine oil. He never called her clever. He handed her a bent hinge or a silent clock and waited while she found why it had stopped. On Saturdays, Daniel took her to his father's workshop near Mount Airy, where Elias Calder repaired scientific instruments beneath a green-shaded lamp. Elias was narrow, with tobacco-colored fingers and a silver loop tied around his neck. He taught Wren to blue screws over an alcohol flame, polish brass with rotten stone, and cut cardboard gear patterns before touching metal. Their ritual never changed. She swept the bench left to right, he brewed tea in a dented kettle, and together they copied one astronomical diagram by hand. Then Elias placed a damaged clock, sextant, or model planet between them and asked, "Where does the motion disappear?" Wren learned to follow force through teeth, arbors, collars, and nested tubes until silence revealed the broken place. "Never blame the whole machine for one dishonest gear," Elias told her. He meant mechanisms, but Daniel heard the warning too, and afterward kept family papers in a locked steel box. Elias died in March 2019, leaving his dividing engine, brass blanks, notebooks, and an unfinished tabletop orrery. Wren saw them once after the funeral beneath a bedsheet. By the next weekend, the room was empty. Her Uncle Martin said the tools had settled debts. No receipts appeared. Daniel died 3 years later when a service elevator counterweight failed inside an old textile building. Martin arrived before the casseroles cooled. He spoke softly, wore gray gloves indoors, and arranged documents beneath Wren's hand. He said the shared apartment could not remain tied up in probate, that signatures were temporary, that he was protecting her mother from taxes. Every explanation came with a yellow tab marking where Wren should sign. When she asked for the steel box, he said Daniel had destroyed it. On November 28, 2022, Wren returned from a bakery shift and found her father's brass plumb bob on the hallway radiator. Martin stood beside 2 grocery cartons. Her mother sat at the kitchen table, both hands around an empty cup. The apartment had been sold. Wren's name, Martin said, had never appeared on the final deed. He placed a $10 bill beneath the plumb bob. "You signed it away. Take this and leave." 8 words. Wren looked at her mother. The woman raised the cup, touched its dry rim to her mouth, and did not speak. Wren wrapped the plumb bob in her tool roll, slipped the bill into its torn hem, and carried 1 carton downstairs. Rain softened the bottom at the curb until her books fell through. She left them because the shelter doors closed at 7. For 6 weeks, she moved along the cold seams of southeastern Pennsylvania. In Philadelphia, she slept upright at Jefferson Station until transit police woke her. In Camden, she spent 2 nights behind a church boiler room, where warm pipes trembled through the brick. A woman at Walter Rand gave her half a pair and directions to a Pennsauken shelter, but every cot was taken. Wren rode buses when drivers accepted coins and learned which laundromats stayed open until dawn. Her money fell from $9.35 to $6.80, then $3.12. She washed in library sinks, dried her socks beneath hand blowers, and kept the tool roll strapped under her coat. The plumb bob bruised her wrist, but she would not trade it. By January, she was spending daylight in Lovett Memorial Library, where radiators clicked like cooling engines. She read repair manuals because they gave each failure a name. One afternoon, beside a copier, she found a county notice printed on thin pink paper. Abandoned structure transfer. Cash deed. $10. The address lay beyond the last bus route, near an old mill road above Wissahickon Creek. The description listed 1 brick and timber workshop, no utilities, disputed access, condemnation pending. Across the bottom, someone had written in blue pencil, former Calder Orrery Works. Wren read the surname 3 times. She pressed the notice flat and traced the faded photograph. Above the broken doorway hung a wooden sign whose final word remained visible. Instruments. At closing time, she copied the clerk's address onto her wrist and spent her last loose coins on a bus north. The $10 bill stayed sewn inside the tool roll. By sunrise, Wren was walking toward a property the county had forgotten, carrying the only price it was willing to accept. The bus carried Wren as far as Chestnut Hill before turning back toward the city. She stepped down beneath a pale sky with the tool roll across her chest and followed Germantown Avenue northwest until storefronts thinned into stone houses and bare trees. The county directions on her wrist had blurred overnight, so she copied them again from memory onto the back of the pink notice. 9 miles remained. By noon, sleet had begun to strike her face, and the temperature fell to 27 degrees. She walked until the soles of her shoes softened and folded at the toes. Near Flowertown, a farmer found her standing beside a fence, staring at the yellow light inside his hay barn. He did not invite her into the house. He lifted the latch, pointed toward a dry corner behind stacked timothy, and left a wool horse blanket on a nail. Wren slept between hay bales while mice moved under the floorboards. The barn held the day's warmth for an hour, then released it. At 3 a.m, she wrapped the tool roll beneath her neck and listened to ice form in the water bucket beside the door. She left before the farmer returned. The next afternoon, the road descended into a small settlement gathered around a stone bridge and a narrow tributary feeding Wissahickon Creek. Wren passed Heller's Hardware, Bellwether Cafe, a boarded pharmacy called Mercer Drugs, Stokes Feed and Seed, and a barber shop with a revolving pole frozen in place. Across from the post office stood a 2-story limestone building with County Records painted above the entrance in worn black letters. Inside, wet wool, old paper, and radiator steam made the air almost sweet. A woman behind the counter wore her white hair in a braid no thicker than a pencil. She was sorting deeds with one finger protected by a red rubber thimble. The brass nameplate before her read, Mrs. Lenora Vale, Deputy Clerk. Wren placed the pink notice on the counter. Mrs. Vale looked at the notice, then at Wren's shoes. "You are here for the Calder property." "Yes, ma'am." The clerk opened a drawer and removed a folder tied with cotton tape. She did not untie it at once. "You understand there is no electricity?" "Yes, ma'am." "You understand the well has not been tested?" "Yes, ma'am." "You understand the county will not repair the access lane?" "Yes, ma'am." "You understand condemnation transfers with the deed?" "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Vale rested both hands on the folder. The radiator clicked behind her, and somewhere in the building a typewriter struck the same letter 3 times. "Do you have the $10? Wren opened the hem of the tool roll with Elias's small seam knife. The bill came out creased into a narrow green square. Mrs. Vale smoothed it beneath a glass paperweight shaped like Independence Hall. The deed consisted of 2 pages. Wren signed slowly, forming every letter the way Elias had taught her to engrave guide marks before cutting brass. The clerk turned to a black press mounted at the corner of the desk. Its handle ended in a worn brass knob. She slid the deed beneath the seal, pulled once, and raised the paper with the county emblem pressed deep into its fibers. "Take Mill Road past the abandoned pumping station," she said. "At the fork, keep left onto Rittenhouse Lane. The lane becomes dirt after the stone culvert. The property is 3/4 of a mile beyond that, behind 2 black walnut trees." She began to return the folder to its drawer, then stopped. "Calder," she said. Wren waited. Mrs. Vale removed her spectacles and wiped them with a square of linen. There was an Elias Calder who came here every March to inspect that building. He paid the delinquent assessment when no owner could be found. Not the taxes, only the assessment that kept the county from tearing it down. Wren's fingers tightened around the deed. He was my grandfather. The clerk put her spectacles back on. He never said he had a granddaughter. He did not know he had to, Mrs. Vale studied her for several seconds, then opened the folder again. Beneath the deed copy lay 11 receipts, each signed in Elias's narrow hand. The final one was dated February 6, 2019, 5 weeks before his death. He asked whether blood could inherit a place without inheriting its debt, Mrs. Vale said. I told him the law did not work that way. What did he say? He said laws were only machines built by people, and some had dishonest gears. The room seemed to contract around the desk. Mrs. Vale placed the final receipt inside Wren's copy of the deed. Then she opened a side drawer, took out the $10 bill, and laid $1 on the counter. The recording fee was $9. The dollar was soft from age and stamped with a blue bank mark. Wren pushed it back. You will need it, Mrs. Vale said. So will the next person. The clerk looked at her, folded the bill once, and placed it in the shallow center drawer beneath her stamp pad. Wren left with the deed inside her shirt. Rittenhouse Lane followed the creek through woods stripped bare by January. At the stone culvert, she met a man repairing woven wire around a chicken yard. His left sleeve was pinned above the elbow, and a black and white dog stood beside him without barking. Studio's uphill, the man said before she asked. Dog's called Bishop. I'm Amos Pike, Wren Calder. At the surname, Amos drove the fence staple with one measured blow. Your people made small worlds up there. My people stopped telling me. He nodded toward the lane. Walnuts mark the turn. Mind the right-hand tree. Lightning opened it last summer. Bishop accompanied her for nearly half a mile, pausing whenever she fell behind. At the walnut trees, the dog stopped. Wren continued alone. The studio stood on a low shelf of land above the creek, 32 feet long and perhaps 18 wide. Its lower walls were fieldstone, its upper frame covered with weathered cedar boards gone silver at the ends. The roof sagged between hand-hewn rafters, with a black opening where shingles had fallen inward. A narrow brick chimney leaned east. Above the front door hung a split sign. Calder and Sons, Astronomical Instruments. Wren touched the word Sons with 2 fingers. The door opened only after she lifted it by the iron latch and forced her shoulder against the swollen frame. Cold air moved from inside, carrying mildew, mouse nests, and the mineral scent of old brass. Her shoe crossed a drift of plaster and struck something that rolled with a wooden knock. A painted planet rested beside the wall, blue beneath its dust. The front room had once received customers. A counter leaned beneath 2 cracked windows, and shallow drawers lined one wall, each fitted with a tarnished label pull. When Wren opened the nearest drawer, powdered velvet clung to her fingertip and tasted metallic when she touched it unknowingly to her lip. The back room was larger. Brass filings shone in the floor cracks where daylight entered through the roof. A broken central shaft lay across a workbench surrounded by split wooden planets and warped rings. Along the rear wall stood a small gear cutting mill with its handwheel missing. Concentric copper tubes rested in a rack, green with oxidation, and a cast brass sun the size of a melon sat crooked in the center of the ruined orrery. She placed both hands on it. The metal held no warmth, yet something inside shifted with a soft, delayed click. Darkness arrived before she could examine it. Wren swept a space between the bench and the cold stove, using a bundle of twigs tied with wire. She ate the crust of bread the farmer had left in the blanket and drank carefully from her remaining bottle. The floor smelled of pine resin when her body warmed it. Wind entered through the roof and moved over the room like breath passing across a bottle. She lay with the deed beneath her coat, the plumb bob in one hand, and the broken mechanical sun 3 feet from her face. Even in the darkest, most chaotic system, an exact mechanism remains if you know which central gear to turn. For the first 3 days, Wren learned the studio by necessity. The well stood 30 yards downhill beneath a rotted cedar cap. She lowered a chipped enamel cup on twine and found water 8 feet below, clear but cold enough to ache in her teeth. She boiled every measure in the blackened kettle beside the stove. The outhouse leaned behind sumac at the property line, its door tied shut with baling wire. At night, she memorized the floorboards. 2 groaned near the counter, 1 snapped beneath the rear window, and a narrow path between the stove and door remained quiet. On the 4th morning, she walked back to Heller's Hardware. The store smelled of kerosene, pine shavings, and iron dust. Glass jars of screws stood behind the counter, and a cast-iron fan turned slowly overhead despite the cold. The owner, Silas Heller, had 1 amber eye and 1 clouded white by an old injury. "You have cash?" he asked. $1. That buys almost 1 stove bolt. Wren placed Elias's county receipt beside it. Silas rubbed his thumb over the signature, then took a green ledger from beneath the counter. "I'll give you 30 days. After that, pay something, even if it's 50 cents. I will." He wrote Wren Calder in block letters and handed her a cracked orange book titled Repairs for the Rural Homeowner. No charge, bad drawings, honest instructions. She left with a wire chimney brush for $6.75, 40 feet of rope for $4.20, a galvanized bucket for $2.10, stove cement for $3.35, a damaged handsaw for $5.50, and cut nails for $2.85. Silas entered each amount in the ledger without rounding down a penny. The chimney took 6 hours. Wren removed the stovepipe and packed a damp rag into the opening. On the roof, she tied the brush to the rope with a bowline and lowered it into the flue, turning clockwise whenever the bristles caught. Brittle creosote came up in flakes like burned bark. Halfway down, the brush struck something solid. She tied an iron nut beneath it for weight and worked the rope until a nest of twigs and a dead starling dropped into the stove. After 12 more passes, the rope no longer returned sticky. She sealed 2 cracks around the collar with stove cement and waited until dusk. Amos Pike had left split pallet wood beside the lane. Wren built a small fire expecting smoke to fill the room. It hovered above the stove, bent toward the flue, and vanished. She held both hands over the warming iron. For supper, she boiled a potato and half an onion, adding salt from a packet saved at the bus station. Steam clouded the nearest pane. It was her first hot meal indoors since November. The next morning, she began the workroom inventory. She found a bent brass sector compass, a mahogany pattern wheel marked with 48 divisions, and a box of miniature cutters wrapped in oil-darkened linen. A foot-powered lathe stood beneath the rear window, its leather belt broken but its headstock sound. 7 wooden planets rested on one shelf. Jupiter still carried a faded red stripe. Nearby lay concentric copper tubes, a smooth-jawed hand vise, astronomical charts dated 1886, and a black notebook swollen shut by damp. The ruined orrery occupied the central bench. Its walnut base measured 4 feet across. Most planetary arms had fallen inward after the vertical shaft snapped, but the iron crank remained attached. The brass sun sat above the gear case in a collar engraved with flames. Wren brushed the mechanism clean and marked every surviving gear with chalk. The largest wheel had 96 teeth. A smaller wheel carried 24, reducing the motion 4 to 1 before it reached the first nested tube. 2 pinions had broken teeth and 1 arbor was bent. The machine had not failed everywhere, it had failed in sequence. At sunset, she tapped each component with the wooden handle of a screwdriver. The walnut base answered with a low note. The copper tubes rang thinly. The brass sun gave a bright bell tone around its shell, but near the engraved collar it produced a dull knock. She tapped again, bright, dull. After loosening the collar, she lifted the sun from its spindle. It weighed nearly 11 pounds, too heavy for a hollow casting of that size. On its underside, a circular cedar disc had been darkened with oil until it looked like part of the shadow. There were no screws. Every third engraved flame leaned slightly clockwise. When Wren pressed one and turned the collar, an internal gear caught. It moved a single tooth, then stopped. She fed lamp oil into the seam and worked the collar patiently. Nearly an hour passed before something inside unwound with the dry rasp of a watch spring. The cedar disc rose the width of a fingernail. Wren lifted it with Elias's seam knife. 3 parcels lay inside, wrapped in waxed cloth and fitted so closely that they could not shift. She removed the smallest first. It held Elias's silver loop, 6 sharpened burins, his graver handles, and a micrometer protected by chamois. The second parcel contained brass sheet, phosphor bronze wire, clock springs tied with blue thread, and a velvet pouch heavy with coins. The third was a square tin box secured by a miniature spiral gear instead of a latch. Wren examined it beneath the loupe. The gear had 13 teeth, with the last tooth cut shallow to release the catch. One deliberate turn opened it, bundles of currency filled the lower half. Above them rested equations written on onion skin paper. The pages calculated an eclipse path using corrections for lunar inclination and Earth's changing orbital speed. Taped inside the lid was a gear smaller than Wren's thumbnail, cut from solid gold. Beneath the equations lay a sealed envelope. To the one who opens the sun. Wren left it untouched and counted the money instead. There were worn 20s, 50s, and $100 notes bound in paper straps. The velvet pouch held a Liberty Head $10 gold piece, 3 Morgan silver dollars, 11 Barber half dollars, and a roll of Indian head cents. Another packet contained mixed bills folded between waxed sheets. The total was $55,400. She counted it again. The figure remained exact. At the bottom of the pouch lay a dark bronze service medal suspended from a faded ribbon. An eagle had been stamped on one face. The reverse bore a hand-cut inscription, Thomas Calder 19. Wren placed the medal beside the unopened letter. She wrapped the money again and returned it to the brass chamber, but carried the envelope outside as darkness gathered. The creek below the ridge reflected a narrow seam of evening sky. Snowmelt moved beneath its ice with a patient grinding sound. Wren stood among the walnut roots, holding the letter inside her coat without breaking the seal. She had opened metal, wood, cloth, and accounts. The words could wait for morning. Even in the darkest, most chaotic system, an exact mechanism remains if you know which central gear to turn. Morning came colorless through the cracked eastern window. Wren set the envelope beside the stove while water heated. The writing on its face slanted forward, narrow and exact, with the capital T formed like the teeth of a small gear. She had seen that hand on labels beneath Elias's bench and on the receipts Mrs. Vale kept tied in cotton tape. She opened the seal with his seam knife. My dear one, whoever you are, if you have found this letter, then you have already done what most people would not. You listened to an object after others decided it was useless. My name is Margaret Ann Calder. In September of 1951, Dr. Samuel Levin at Pennsylvania Hospital told me that I had cancer of the pancreas and perhaps 4 months in which my hands would still obey me. I returned here from Philadelphia that afternoon and began preparing the sun. Our line in this trade began with Josiah Calder, who arrived from Bristol in 1772 and opened a small instrument room near 2nd Street. His daughter Abigail Calder carried the work north in 1798 after yellow fever emptied the neighborhood. Her son Nathaniel built this studio in 1826 beside the creek, where water and quiet made accurate cutting possible. My father, Edmund Calder, born here in 1874, taught me to divide a circle before he taught me to sign my name. I was born in 1878 and took charge of the benches after his hands failed. My husband Thomas left for France in 1917. He died near the Meuse in October of 1918. The medal beside this letter was returned without his watch. Our son continued the shop for a time, but precision instruments became factory goods and grief made poor company for apprentices. Calder Orrery Works closed on November 3, 1919. After that date, the sign remained, but the trade did not. More than 30 years passed in silence. I kept the machinery oiled. I kept the drawings dry. I also kept enough money to preserve the building if preservation ever became possible. Money alone cannot do that. It requires hands willing to learn slowly. If you intend to restore the central model, begin with the 96-tooth wheel and do not correct the bent arbor until you have measured its original throw. Cut replacement pinions from half-hard brass, never soft sheet. For the nested tubes, allow 1 part clearance in 200, or winter contraction will bind them. Blue the smallest screws at 570 degrees Fahrenheit until they show cornflour, then cool them in clean oil. The lunar train must run at a ratio of 13,368,746 to 1 against the yearly wheel. Do not round it for convenience. The heavens do not become simpler because a maker is tired. The eclipse figures enclosed are unfinished. They account for the slow turning of the lunar nodes and the uneven speed of Earth in its orbit. Whether the equations are valuable, I cannot say. Their worth to me was the discipline of returning each night to a problem that refused flattery. Inheritance is not what one person hides and another spends. It is a tool kept sharp, a measurement copied correctly, a roof repaired before rain reaches the bench. It is knowledge passed to someone who may never know your face. Use the money carefully. Keep the gold gear where you can see it when you are tempted to hurry. It was cut from Thomas's wedding band after the telegram came, behind the back door, beneath the roots of the eastern walnut. There is a small stone marker bearing Abigail's compass and orbit mark. Light the old whale oil inspection lamp before you move it. Some things should be seen first in the light that served them. I do not know whether you are family. Blood has failed this house before. Care is the only claim I recognize. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. Margaret Ann Calder, October 12, 1951. Read the letter once beside the stove and again at the workbench. On the second reading, she stopped at the sentence about the wedding ring and placed the tiny gold gear in her palm. Its teeth left 13 shallow marks against her skin. She folded the pages along Margaret's original creases, slid them back into the envelope, and held it beneath the brass sun until her breathing became even. Then she went through the rear door. The eastern walnut stood downhill from the studio, its roots exposed where rain had cut the bank. Wren cleared frozen leaves with a piece of cedar board. Beneath the largest root she found a rectangular limestone marker no wider than her hand. Its surface carried a carved circle crossed by a compass arm. She did not move it. Back inside, she searched the workroom shelves until she found a squat brass inspection lamp behind a row of pattern wheels. The wick had hardened and old fuel had turned to varnish in the reservoir. Wren cleaned the tube with cotton thread, filled it with lamp oil from the hardware store, and trimmed the wick to 1/8 of an inch. The flame rose small and steady. It illuminated the engraving on the sun, the scratches on Elias's loop, and the worn place on Margaret's letter where a thumb had rested 71 years earlier. Wren set the lamp in the front window. That afternoon, small kindnesses returned to her in order. The farmer near Flourtown had left bread inside a horse blanket without asking her history. The woman at Walter Rand had divided a pear with her thumbnail. Amos had stacked dry pallet wood beside the lane and sent Bishop to guide her uphill. Mrs. Vale had kept one folded dollar in her drawer because Wren had asked that something remained for whoever came next. None of them had rescued her. Each had moved one honest gear. Perhaps someone watching had once received a kindness that looked too small to matter at the time. A meal, a ride, a warm room, or one sentence spoken without judgment. What was it, and whose hand placed it in your life? That night, Wren wrapped Margaret's letter, Elias's loop, the service medal, and the gold gear in clean linen. She placed the bundle beside her head instead of returning it to the hollow sun. The inspection lamp burned low on the bench until sleep found her. The first snow came on December 2, 2022. 4 inches laid quietly across the broken roof and the walnut roots below. Wren read the roofing chapter in the orange repair book 3 times beside the stove, then climbed into the attic with a folding ruler. The main slope measured 32 feet by 11 on each side. Allowing for overlap and waste, she calculated 24 bundles of cedar shingles, 2 rolls of 30-pound felt, and 16 pounds of hot-dipped nails. The arithmetic consumed half a page. The cost consumed nearly every dollar she allowed herself from the first small bundle of cash. Silas delivered the materials in an old feed truck. Before leaving, he handed her a roofing hatchet with a square pole and a gauge pin worn almost smooth. "My brother's," he said. "He won't need it." The next morning, Amos brought Walter Dunn, a retired roofer of 73 whose beard grew white on one side and iron gray on the other. Walter inspected the bowed north slope, pressed one thumb into a softened rafter, and refused the envelope Wren offered. Save it for lumber. For 11 days they worked beneath skies the color of tin. Wren sistered the damaged rafter with a new length of Douglas fir, bolting soundwood 3 feet beyond each rotten end. Walter snapped a chalk line across the felt and taught her to set each nail with 3 strokes, one to start, one to seat, one to judge. That nail's proud. Wren looked along the shingle course. Pull it, she did. By the 6th day, her shoulders ached before breakfast. By the 9th, she could gauge 5 inches of exposure without reaching for the ruler. They finished the ridge on December 14th, laying the final cap shingles into a cold west wind. That night, snow struck the roof and remained outside. January exposed what firelight had concealed. The lower chimney bricks had begun to spall, their faces peeling away in thin red shells. Mortar beneath the roof line turned to powder when Wren rubbed it between her fingers. She dismantled only the loose courses, numbering each salvageable brick in chalk before carrying it down in a bucket. Silas supplied hydraulic lime, washed sand, and fire clay. For the outer joints, she mixed 1 part lime to 2½ parts sand. Around the flue, she used 1 part fire clay, 1 part lime, and 3 parts sharp sand, adding water until the mortar held a clean ridge on the trowel. The work took 3 weeks in temperatures that remained in the 20s. Every 15 minutes, her bare fingers went numb. Gloves protected her skin but spoiled her judgment, so she worked without them, warming her hands against a covered jar filled with stove-heated stones. She dampened each brick before bedding it, kept the rebuilt courses wrapped in burlap, and misted them twice daily so the lime would cure rather than freeze dry. One morning, a repaired joint cracked from overnight cold. Wren cut it out completely and began again. On January 27th, Walter stood outside while she lit the test fire. A ribbon of smoke entered the flue, rose past the new brickwork, and left the chimney in one straight gray column. No smoke entered the room. Walter watched the draw for a full minute, then tapped the wall with 2 knuckles. That will keep. Beneath the dirt and brass filings, the floors were white pine fastened with hand-cut rose-head nails. Wren drove every raised nail below the surface with a narrow punch, then rented a random orbit sander from Heller's for $14 a day. Silas warned her that old pine could disappear beneath an impatient machine. She began in the darkest corner and moved with the grain, never allowing the spinning pad to rest. The first pass used 80 grit discs and lifted decades of soot. The second, at 120, erased the coarse scratches. The final pass at 220 left the boards smooth without making them look new. Dust reached her eyelashes, ears, and the folded cuffs of her trousers. She sealed the doors with old sheets, but a pale film still settled over the brass sun and every drawer pull. At night, she vacuumed the cracks with a borrowed shop machine and wiped the floor with mineral spirits until the cloth came away clean. She applied 3 thin coats of tung oil, rubbing each one by hand and allowing a 48-hour cure after the last. The boards changed from dull brown to dark honey, then deepened toward mahogany around the iron nail heads. There was one morning when she did nothing. She had risen with the intention of sanding the front threshold, but at the marsh below the creek a great blue heron stood in shallow water, motionless except for one feather lifting at its neck. Wren sat on the bank until afternoon and watched the bird take 3 patient steps. When she returned, she covered the sander and left the threshold untouched. The next day, her hands were steadier. The studio had 8 windows, 3 held no glass at all. 4 retained cracked panes that shifted in their rabbets whenever the wind pressed against them. The 8th contained 1 original pane from 1788, green at the edge and rippled enough to bend the walnut branches into water. Wren preserved that pane. She removed the other sashes one at a time, softened the failed putty beneath a low heat lamp, and lifted each glazing point with Elias's narrow pliers. Replacement glass came from discarded storm windows Silas had stored behind the hardware shop. She rolled DAP 33 glazing putty between her palms until it was warm, pressed a thin bedding line into the rabbet, and set the glass without forcing the corners. After placing fresh points every 8 inches, she drew the putty knife in one continuous stroke, leaving a bevel that met the sight line of the interior muntin. The sash cords had rotted into black fibers. She replaced them with 1/4-inch cotton cord, feeding each length over the pulley and securing it to the cast-iron counterweight with a figure-8 knot. When the first repaired sash rose and remained open by itself, she lowered it 3 times simply to hear the weights move inside the wall. The 7th window fought her for an afternoon. One pulley had frozen around a bent axle, and the lower rail was swollen nearly a 1/4 inch. Wren planed it by hand, checking the fit after every 6 strokes. She saved the 1788 pane for last. Rather than remove it, she repaired the surrounding putty in short sections, supporting the glass with her palm from inside. Outside, February light passed through the old ripples and laid uneven bands across her sleeve. As she finished the final corner, a chickadee landed on the nearest walnut branch. It tilted its black-capped head toward the open sash, gave one clear note, and remained there while Wren pressed the last line of putty smooth. Behind the loose plaster, Wren found hand-split oak lath, each strip uneven and darkened by 2 centuries of smoke. Much of it still held. Near the chimney, however, 3 early patches failed before noon, dropping to the floor in damp slabs because she had mixed the lime too wet and pressed it against dry wood. Silas brought an old burlap bag of horsehair from his back room. "My father saved everything," he said. Wren soaked the lath, teased the hair apart, and folded it into lime plaster until each handful held together without sagging. She pressed on a scored scratch coat, waited until it resisted her thumb, then added a 3/8-inch brown coat. That cured for 72 hours beneath damp cloth. The final finish coat measured barely 1/8 inch and took the light without hiding the wall's small irregularities. At the chimney corner, she smoothed the last patch with a steel trowel. "These patches will hold another 100 years." She did not say it aloud. Doris Bellwether began leaving paper bags on the doorstep before sunrise. She was a broad woman with silver spectacles hung on a beaded chain and flour always caught along one sleeve. The bags held yesterday's biscuits, heel ends of ham, bruised apples, and sometimes a jar of soup wrapped in newspaper. When Wren carried money to the cafe, Doris pushed the coins back across the counter with one square fingernail. "Pay me in candles when the shop reopens." Wren did not promise that it would. She washed the return jar and left it on the cafe step. Caleb Pike arrived one Saturday on a blue Schwinn with a splitting maul balanced across the handlebars. He was 15, long-limbed, and wore a red wool cap pulled over both ears. Without asking permission, he began splitting the storm-fallen walnut limbs Amos had dragged near the woodshed. Wren offered him $3 after the first cord. He kept his eyes on the grain of the next round, my mother said. "About your grandfather." The sentence remained unfinished. Caleb set the wood upright and brought the maul down clean through its center. Before riding home, he stacked enough fuel for 6 days beneath the eaves. Reverend Boyd passed each morning on the road to the chapel. He wore polished brown shoes even in mud and had a white mustache that lifted when he tipped his hat. He never entered the studio. He only paused at the lane, raised 2 fingers toward the roof, and offered the same forward prayer. "Keep her work honest." Wren heard him through the open window and continued cutting putty from a sash. She postponed the cellar until February 11th. The door beneath the rear stairs had swollen shut, and opening it released air that smelled of stone, roots, and cold iron. 7 granite steps descended to a 12 by 15-foot floor laid in the fieldstone. Water marked the lower wall but did not stand beneath it. At the center rested a dressed granite slab, too regular to be part of the foundation. A compass and orbit mark had been carved into one corner. Wren cleaned the grooves with a dry brush. She did not lift it. Under the 3rd step, her fingers touched a small oak box wedged behind the riser. Its iron clasp had rusted away. Inside lay a brass key whose bow formed 2 crossing planetary rings around a central sun. Beneath the key was a tintype wrapped in wool. The image showed a young woman standing outside the studio in the summer of 1903. She held a gear-cutting arbor against her skirt. Her hair was darker than Wren's, her dress high at the throat, but the direct gaze, narrow jaw, and slight tilt of one shoulder might have belonged to Wren in borrowed clothes. On the back, scratched through the black varnish, were the words, "Clara Calder, daughter of Edmund, age 25, summer of 1903. Wren carried the key upstairs and placed it on the mantel beside the inspection lamp. She tried it in the desk, the tin box, the pattern drawers, and the lock beneath the gear mill. It fit none of them. There it remained. Snow withdrew from the lane in narrow gray islands. The creak grew loud enough to hear from the front room, and the black walnuts hung out green catkins that trembled in every light wind. Wren repaired small things. She sharpened the burins, replaced the lathe belt, and sorted the surviving brass by thickness. She did not begin a full orrery that spring. Margaret's ratios deserved more than courage, and courage was not yet skill. She chose $1 Morgan from the velvet pouch and exchanged it through a coin dealer in the city. With part of the money, she bought half-hard brass sheet, fine files, and a packet of high-carbon drill blanks. She practiced cutting simple gears no wider than a quarter, measuring every tooth before allowing herself another. Most were imperfect. She kept them in a shallow drawer. The house was patient, so was she. 2 winters later, on December 21, 2024, Wren completed the first instrument that deserved to remain assembled. It was not large. The walnut base measured 14 inches across, and the brass sun at its center was no bigger than a walnut. Earth traveled on a narrow arm of blued steel. The moon moved around it through a differential train Wren had cut twice before achieving the proper relationship. When she turned the crank, the yearly wheel advanced without hesitation, the lunar carrier followed, and the little painted sphere completed its motion without binding at the coldest point in the room. She let it run through 12 revolutions. Then she stopped and listened. Nothing scraped, nothing slipped. The restored studio around her held winter light in its plaster and glass. The white pine floors showed old nail heads beneath their oil. Tools stood in fitted racks above the rear bench. The original 1788 pane still bent the walnut branches into wavering lines, while the roof, chimney, and 8 repaired windows kept the weather where it belonged. She placed the new orrery beneath Margaret's inspection lamp. The brass key remained on the mantel. In March, a windstorm tore a dead limb from the eastern walnut and exposed an iron plate set into the trunk where bark had grown around its edges. Wren found it while cutting away splintered wood. The plate bore the same compass and orbit mark as Abigail's stone and the granite slab below the cellar. The key entered cleanly. A quarter turn released a narrow door lined with sheet copper. Inside lay a folded 48-star American flag, dry despite the decades, and a note tied with faded blue thread. The paper was dated October 6, 1918. Clara had written it while Thomas Calder served in France during the Meuse-Argonne offensive. She addressed the note to the child he might never meet and described how Margaret, then still a girl, had stood beside the dividing engine counting teeth aloud while her mother read casualty lists in the newspaper. Clara did not write about glory. She wrote that Thomas had repaired field telephones because wires, like families, failed first where they had been joined too quickly. She asked that the flag be kept until someone could place his medal where his name was spoken among the dead. Wren folded the note along its original lines and returned the flag to its copper chamber until autumn. On November 11, 2025, she carried Thomas Calder's medal to the Philadelphia National Cemetery. Amos drove. Mrs. Vale came with a paper sleeve containing copies of the old assessment receipts. At the grave, Wren laid the medal beneath his name for 1 minute, then pinned it inside the folded flag before taking both home. There was no speech. Wind moved through the cemetery oaks, and Reverend Boyd's 4-word prayer was enough. Of the old cash, Wren used only 4 coins. The first bought brass and drill blanks. The second paid for a replacement dividing plate for the gear mill. The third purchased seasoned walnut from a cabinet maker retiring in Roxborough. The fourth covered the legal work that placed the studio and its remaining contents into a preservation trust. The bills stayed wrapped in waxed cloth. The gold gear remained beneath glass beside Margaret's letter. Everything else returned to the double-walled brass sun with a new envelope laid on top. Across the front, Wren wrote, "For the next one." The shop reopened without announcement. Doris pinned an index card to the cafe corkboard between a lost cat notice and an advertisement for piano lessons. Calder Astronomical Instruments repairs accepted by appointment. The card listed no telephone number. Customers left their names with Doris or mailed notes to the post office box. Within 3 months, the waiting list held more than 40 names. A school with a broken classroom planetarium. A surveyor's widow with her husband's transit. 2 clock collectors, and a museum seeking repair of a damaged demonstration orrery. Wren accepted 6 pieces. The others could wait. Caleb returned in April carrying a long object wrapped in a quilt. He was taller, his red cap replaced by a canvas work jacket. though the blue Schwinn still leaned against the walnut tree. "I made something," he said. The sign was carved from a board taken from the lightning-split branch. He had copied the surviving letters from the old lintel, cutting them deep and filling them with black milk paint. Calder and Sons Astronomical Instruments. Beneath Sons, he had fastened a smaller board. Daughters. Wren ran her thumb along the fresh chisel marks. "You left the strokes showing. My father said you'd prefer it." She looked toward Amos, who stood at the lane with Bishop's gray-muzzled successor beside him. Amos lifted one hand but did not come closer. Wren and Caleb hung the sign together. They used forged hooks beneath the eaves and stepped back until the lettering settled into the building as though it had always been planned that way. That summer, Caleb began coming twice a week. Wren did not call him an apprentice. She gave him brass scraps, a jeweler's saw, and the same first instruction Elias had once given her: cut the shape in cardboard before touching metal. On October 12th, she sat at Margaret's bench with a clean sheet of onion skin paper. The first line took longer than the rest. "My dear one, whoever you are." Wren wrote that the roof had been repaired with cedar, that the chimney drew clean, and that the old gear mill could now divide a wheel into 360 equal parts without losing a mark. She described the errors in her first lunar train and included the corrected measurements. She warned that the north wall should be checked after every hard winter and that the 1788 pane must never be forced from its sash. She did not write about Martin. She wrote that inheritance could arrive after betrayal without belonging to it. At dusk, she carried the unfinished letter outside. Caleb had gone home. The creek moved beyond the walnuts, hidden by leaves but exact in its course. Through the front window, the small orrery turned beneath the inspection lamp, each planet moving at its own patient speed. Even in the darkest, most chaotic system, an exact mechanism remains if you know which central gear to turn. Wren returned to the bench and added one final instruction beneath the date: leave one thing unfinished so the next careful hand has somewhere to begin. She placed the letter beside the gold gear but did not seal it. Outside, evening gathered over the repaired roof in the narrow lane. The walnut sign moved once in the wind, then became still. The historic orrery maker's studio waits. It has always waited. In the county records office, Mrs. Vale retired the following spring. Before emptying her desk, she found the folded $1 bill beneath the brass stamp pad. She left it in the center drawer for the next clerk.